How important are specifications and measurements in audio equipment? Well, let's get into it. As always, simple question, kind of complicated answer. And initially I was tempted to shoot some really long-winded video going into deep detail about every single component and what's important and what's not when it comes to specs and measures, but let's not do that. I can do that if you want, and drop me a comment below if you would like to see something like that. But instead, I think let's just talk briefly about the kind of theory and the basics of when specifications and measurements do and do not so much matter. And to be clear, what I mean by specs and measures is when you are looking at a piece of audio equipment, the manufacturer will generally supply some kind of spec sheet with a bunch of data and information about the product, ranging from, basic stuff like dimensions to test measurements. For example, self-noise, distortion, dynamic range, power output for amplifiers, power consumption, this kind of thing. You get what I'm saying. And in all of my time as an audio enthusiast and as an audiophile, I've generally noticed that there are a few major approaches that people would use when it comes to specifications and measurements for their equipment. And the first group really doesn't look too much at specs and measures at all, apart from maybe the most critical things like how much power an amplifier might make. They don't tend to look too much at them. And whether it's because they just don't understand them, or whether they do, but they just don't prefer to put too much emphasis on them, this group usually really lets their ears do all of the heavy lifting about whether any kind of equipment is going to really work out for them or not. Is it going to meet their objectives or not? That approach really requires a lot of auditioning. And the second main approach then is going to be really the opposite of that. Now, this group of people puts a lot of emphasis on specs and measures, and they really base their opinions about equipment and bases their purchasing decisions and their personal opinions about how something might be performing really almost entirely on those specs and measurements. For this group, I think they consider what's on paper to be the ultimate authority of how something is going to perform and how it was designed and what the design intended and this sort of thing. And then the third approach really is kind of a mix of the two. This is the group of people that really uses the relevant specs and measures that they need to establish general guardrails about what equipment might and might not work for them, to identify those pieces of equipment that they might want to look into further. And I will say that I'm firmly in that third category. When I am looking at a piece of equipment, no matter what it is, and whether I'm just looking at it out of curiosity, or if I'm looking to buy, or maybe I'm thinking about switching up components in my system, for sure I will always look at the spec sheet and the measurements, and I will take many of them into consideration. Reason being, they can help you identify clues as to what the manufacturer might have been intending for that piece of equipment, what their design ethos might have been with it. And as I said before, they really help to establish general guardrails about whether a piece of equipment is going to work at all for you, for your objectives. For example, if you know you need a certain power output from an amplifier, the power output spec is obviously really, really important. When you're buying speakers, the sensitivity really matters because it helps you match it to the amp, so on and so forth. But beyond that, there are a lot of measurements on there, and they can be useful and are generally always interesting, but they can also really mislead you if you aren't using them carefully. So let's talk a little bit about that. The first group of person that I mentioned that really is not paying any attention to specs and measures at all, well, I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with that, so long as you're identifying equipment that is going to work for you at all. If your speakers are not very efficient and they absolutely need, let's say, 100 watts or something, you know that you don't want to be looking at a 30-watt amplifier, just as one example, okay? But beyond that, letting your ears do all of the heavy lifting, I don't think that there's anything really wrong with that. And I'm not saying that my approach is the absolute only way to do this, okay? But with the second group of people who put almost total emphasis on the specs and measures, I don't know if I necessarily always agree with that approach, and that might ruffle some feathers, but I think when you're looking at the measurement data in particular, you can't just assume that one number being higher or lower than another is necessarily going to be the ultimate authority on what that piece of equipment is capable of. And the reason is, each component is its own little system, right? It's had a design mentality applied to it. It has had various component selections given to it to make a certain system where all of the different components inside and the circuit design all have to be in some kind of balance. And trying to allow only what's on paper be some kind of ultimate indicator of exactly how that equipment is going to sound, it definitely can be a folly. And I think there's some mentality among that group where specifications and measurements can really eliminate a lot of bias. But I would argue personally that it can really introduce a lot of bias, especially if you're not fully appreciating the complexity of the system that each component is, and then the complexity of the audio system that you're putting it in, and the interplay between all the different components and the different designs that you're trying to put together to make an audio reproduction system. So that really is why I like to take the approach of, using the specs and measures to establish what's going to work for you at all and be worthy of further investigation, and to get some ideas about what the manufacturer was really trying to accomplish with that component. But at the end of the day, it's really, really important for your ears to do a lot of the work too. Once you've identified what's worthy of your time and your audition, I think one of the hardest things about being an audio enthusiast is learning how to trust your ears and really be objective about what you're hearing. And there are all kinds of factors when we're looking at audio equipment that can really act as variables that can cause us not to be as objective as we could be. And that's why I think it's really a challenge sometimes to be truly objective. In my earlier days as an audio enthusiast, I would sometimes fall into a trap where I would feel like a certain approach or design really was the right way to do things, and I wouldn't consider other ways. And with some time and experience, and just hearing lots of different things and hearing lots of different types of systems and investigating different types of equipment, I had to learn to let go of that a little bit and not make my personal preferences give me too much bias into how I might dismiss other pieces of equipment. For example, if you like tube amps, it can be easy to get so far into the tube amp rabbit hole that you might go, I'll never listen to anything solid state. That is the wrong way to do things. I never like how any solid state piece of equipment sounds. I will only listen to tube amps, right? You could really be costing yourself some really interesting experiences that you might have had if you'd kind of kept a more open mind, right? And tried to eliminate some of that bias that you might be tempted to have. And personally, I've learned that the hard way. So, and I've had the good fortune of opening up my mind and sometimes being surprised at how a piece of equipment that once upon a time I might have dismissed, I gave a chance to it and ended up liking it. So I think when we're looking at specifications and measurements, we really need to keep in mind that it's easy to lose our objectivity as audio enthusiasts if we're putting too much emphasis on those things. And I think it's also very important to remember that at the end of the day, listening to audio, listening to music, and whatever else you might be listening to on your systems, if you're a cinephile and watching movies or whatever it is that you're listening to, whatever you're putting a system together for, we have to remember that at the end of the day, that is an entirely emotional experience, and emotions are very, very individualized and subjective. And that sounds obvious, but it's actually very easy to lose sight of that, especially for those of us who do have enthusiasm over putting together audio systems and investigating different pieces of equipment. It's very easy to lead yourself astray. And it's also very easy for other people's very strong opinions to sort of lead you astray and introduce bias. So before we talk more about specs and measures, I think something that we have to stop and consider is that audio is just vibrations in the air, right? It's just air vibrations, ripples in the wind, so to speak, right? At the end of the day, that's really what it is. And those vibrations are tunneling into our ears and tickling little bitty hairs in our ears, and our brain is going through a neurological process to turn that into some type of perception that we're experiencing and that we have an emotional response to, okay? That's what listening is. And that's going to be very different from one person to the next. And again, that sounds obvious. We all fundamentally know this, but it's easy to lose sight of that. The shape and size of my ears and the thickness of the skin in my ears and my ear canals and my eardrums and the little hairs inside of my ears are a little bit different and tuned differently and cause different perceptions than yours do, and the next person's and the next person's and the next person's. And we have to remember that it's almost kind of amazing that we can all find some commonality in how we're perceiving different pieces of equipment. And I think we also need to remember that you can take any one piece of equipment and, it will have the same measurements, right? With good manufacturing tolerances, any of those same model would measure the same, and you can give those models to 10 different people who are all hearing the same piece of equipment with the same measurements, but they will all come away with slightly different experiences with that piece of equipment. And so we really always need to remember the total subjectivity and the sort of futility of human emotions sometimes. You know what I mean? I've been thinking about this ever since I did a reaction video a little bit ago that was reacting to, I basically was reviewing reviewers. It was about an integrated amplifier, Cambridge Audio CXA81, and that's actually something that I personally own, and I thought it would be interesting to go back and look at some reviews of when those came out and then apply my personal lived experience with it to what the reviewers were saying and see how much of it I agreed with. And in that video, one of the reviewers was saying that he found that amplifier to be voiced coldly. It was sort of a cold sounding amplifier, he reckoned, and he wished it was a little bit warmer and a little bit sweeter sounding. Well, I didn't agree that it was necessarily a cold sounding amplifier. In my personal opinion, it was by no means a warm amplifier. That CX81 is not warm or sweet, he's right. But I've heard really cold and analytical and sterile sounding amplifiers, and I did not think this one crossed that threshold. In my opinion, and based on my experience with different pieces of equipment, I think it's pretty neutral and kind of right down the middle in terms of its sonic character as far as how warm or cool it is. So, that was an example of how he and I could both hear the same one piece of equipment, and interestingly, we both agreed on how it sounded generally. We both heard the same sonic characteristics, but he came away calling it, or basically saying that it had a slightly different voice than I felt it had, and that just goes to show how different we all perceive things. It's a little bit different for all of us. And ultimately, what he wanted out of the amp was not what that amp did. And what I wanted out of the amp is what it did. And so I was happier with it than he was. And that's perfectly fair and relevant. But the point of all that is, if you were only looking at the spec sheet for that amp, you wouldn't necessarily have that same experience that he and I did, where we had to just hear it and draw our own conclusions. You can't just look at a spec sheet and go, oh, I know exactly how that amplifier is going to sound. Based on the damping factor and the total harmonic distortion and the class that it runs in, I can tell you exactly how that's going to sound. You really can't do that. That's really oversimplifying what those specs are telling you. So I think if you're putting a ton of emphasis on specs and measures, you really could be eliminating a lot of really interesting experiences. Let's go back to the original question of how important are specifications and measurements. Well, the slightly complicated answer to this simple question is, some of them are absolutely critical and you can't ignore them, and others are not nearly as important as some people would have you believe. That's the honest truth based on my personal experience, okay? Couple of quick examples of what is really crucial. Well, like with the amplifier, you have to know how much power it's putting out, and you have to know the basic power requirements of your speakers. When it comes to speakers, you have to know what their efficiency is, their sensitivity, because that's going to drive your amp and speaker pairing. And those are really important things. You kind of can't ignore those. You could end up putting together a pairing that really isn't going to work very well for you. Maybe the amplifier you're picking does not make enough power for the room that you're putting the speakers in. Maybe the speaker size is not appropriate for the size of room that you're putting them in. Or maybe the speakers are matched to your room, but the speakers are not well matched to the amp. And getting that system in balance is important, and you do need to pay attention to some of those basic specifications, right? Something else that's really important, just as an example, is if you're putting together a turntable rig, the phono cartridge and the tone arm, the interplay between them is really important. And if you look at no other specifications for those, you need to match up the correct cartridge compliance with the effective mass of your tone arm. If you don't do that, you can really have some problems. There can be rumble issues, you can have tracking problems if you don't get those matched properly. So, that's a couple examples of things that you really must pay attention to and be able to understand what those facts and figures mean when you're looking at spec sheets. But then there are definitely other measurements that are not nearly as important as some people might think. For example, total harmonic distortion in a solid state amplifier, or tube amps for that matter. Some people might have you think that no tube amp can possibly sound good because some of them have like 1% total harmonic distortion figures, for example. And that's kind of a lot when it comes to THD in amplifiers. And they might reckon that only a solid state amplifier can possibly sound clean and sound pleasing because, a good solid state amplifier might measure total harmonic distortion of like 0.025 or 0.005%, really, really low figure compared to a tube amp. But the reality is that's not the whole story. For one thing, different levels of distortion can sound more or less pleasing to the human ear. So if you're comparing like a 1% total harmonic distortion of a tube amp, but those are even order harmonic distortions, that's going to sound more pleasing to the human ear than would like odd order. And if that wasn't the case, nobody would be listening to tube amps. Nobody would be listening to vinyl. Nobody would be listening to rock music, which is chock full of tons and tons and tons of pleasing sounding even order harmonics. Distorted guitars, for example. So, you can't just go, well, that one figure for that tube amp can't possibly be good because, you need to get a solid state with a way lower total harmonic distortion figure. Well, the solid state amps, THD, might be based on like odd order harmonics that really do not sound pleasing to the human ear. So I think just looking at the number isn't as important as taking into consideration what types of distortion you're talking about with THD. And this is just one example of one measurement, right? And, you know, even within solid state amps, some people might have you believe that if amp A has that measurement of 0.025 and amp B has that measurement of 0.005, what's a slam dunk? You should buy amp B because it's got the lower total harmonic distortion. But in reality, the difference between those figures, you're probably not going to hear it at all. And not only that, pretty much any source material you'd be playing through that amplifier is going to have so much more inherent distortion on it that it stops being important. So that's an example of a figure that is interesting, but is not really telling you how that's going to perform. And that's really what I mean when I say that some specs and measures are much more important than others, and some really needed some attention paid to them, and others are a matter of interest but not importance. And for me personally, by no means would I ever let a measurement on paper be the final arbiter of whether I would buy a piece of equipment and have it in my system or not. At the end of the day, I will always let my ears and my perception of what I'm hearing be the final arbiter of whether something's really going to work for me or not. You know, the other issue with measurements is there is not a lot of broad industry standardization in how those measurements might be taking. Like, there's not some firm requirement about the types of measurement equipment you have to be using and what reference points you're using for those measurements. There are some generally accepted principles in taking measurements. For example, a lot of times harmonic distortion is going to be measured with like a 1 kilohertz sine wave at a certain reference level. And as long as everybody who's providing you measurements on spec sheets is doing that, you can draw some comparisons between different pieces of equipment of like kind to see how they might compete with one another. Again, it's not going to tell you absolutely how they sound, but what you can do with measurements is take all of the measurements for a piece of equipment together and compare all those to another competing product to get some idea about the design mentality that the manufacturer might have had. And when you do that, when you take a look at the total system within that component, how robust the power supply is versus whether they're using off-the-shelf transistors, for example, or IC chips versus some kind of discrete special design. Are they clearly pushing in their specifications really, really low self-noise and really, really low distortion and really, really robust power supplies with really careful consideration given to how the power is being distributed in that device? That might give you a clue that their mentality is that they want a really, really clean sounding and highly resolving type of presentation. That won't guarantee that's what's happening, but it can give you some clues compared to like another product that has higher figures in all those regards and a cheaper power supply. What might be that they're pushing a sense of perceived musicality in that design, or they're using distortion to give a certain pleasant but not super clean sound to that piece of equipment. And that might have been their mentality, is instead of it measuring really well, they wanted to give it a certain sonic character. So you can use those measurements to help you make some basic comparative judgments about the mentality of the manufacturer. But I don't think that you can use those figures to determine just by what's on paper how that's going to sound for you. But again, as I say, you can use some of those measurements to determine whether that piece of equipment is going to work in your system and with your other components at all or not. So that's really what I wanted to say about the importance of specifications and measurements, and just give a general overview on how they might work out for you and what's really important and what's not. And I hope that helps give you some insight onto what you can do with that information. Now, if any of you out there would like me to go into further detail, maybe on a component by component type basis, different sources, analog and digital, and different types of amplifiers, and what I think are really important and not so important specs and measures. For those, I certainly can do that. Just drop me a comment below. But, otherwise I gave you some food for thought, and I'd like to hear from you in the comments too. What is your personal approach to using specifications and measurements? Which of those kind of three main categories would you put yourself in, and how has that worked out for you in your audio journey? I'd love to hear what you have to say. I appreciate each and every one of you who watches these videos. If you enjoyed this one, please consider liking and subscribing if you'd like to see more content like this. Doing that really helps out small channels like mine, and I really appreciate it. So thanks again, and I will see you next time.